This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to a new year of International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Roundup regulars John Katzka and Hamilton and Robert Kraig are here to help us ring in 2020 with a look at some trends likely to shape the global environment in the months ahead, including persistent mass protests on several continents that are proving difficult for governments to put down. Is there a common thread? An assertive and ascendant China that's trying to reshape relations across Asia and beyond, and the growing impact of climate change on policymaking in nations around the world. But first, the rise of populism is reshuffling the political deck around the world as voters' long-standing party alliances are shifting. John, I will turn to you, as is our tradition, for the first New Year's word on this. So what about this? What do we take from, for example, Labour's drubbing in the UK elections?
Well, populism is in the United States, where we are much more familiar with it, is coming from both ends, from the left and the right. But populism in itself is linked to a whole bunch of other things. In the United States, anti-establishmentarianism, what a mouthful of word there, and tribalism and authoritarianism are all pieces of what we're seeing going on internationally. And the question becomes, well, why is this happening now? And I'll point to two things. One, I think the end of the Cold War and a strategic construct that we had that sort of ordered the world for 40 plus years has gone away. And we haven't come up with a new strategic definition for the world. And in the process, we're watching the growth of authoritarian leaders around the world. Robert Kagan, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, comes up with a way in which to look at authoritarianism. And that is, it has always been the prevailing doctrine in the world. It is democracy that has the uphill fight to try to be able to survive in that climate. The second part is the transition from the industrial to the information age, and the fact that each of these epochal changes brings on new winners and losers, and that it's the values that are existing are under assault, and we're seeing all of those things play out in varying ways around the world.
Well, and let's focus in on one of the recent examples. I mentioned at the outset that the UK election, there were constituencies that went for the Tories that had been Labour strongholds for 80 years or more. What do you think's going on there?
That's a hard one to analyze because of the whole overlay of Brexit, particularly, and because the two main party leaders both had their major problems. But I think that there was a very, very negative campaign going on about Jeremy Corbyn. He did not run a particularly effective campaign. They did some flip-flopping on Brexit, basically, and in the end came out and said they were for a second referendum, which alienated a part of the party. It's really hard to say. I don't really think that the vote there is indicative of any really long trend, although a number of those constituents that voted Conservatives instead of voting Labour, as they had for many, many years, were in parts of the country that were very disaffected, left out, not doing well economically, sort of the standard appeal to a populist agenda. But the other problem with this is that populism itself is a very vague term. I mean, it can be used to refer to somebody on the right, to somebody on the left. It's generally a direct appeal between a leader who tends to be somewhat charismatic, however you define that, and a group of disaffected people with promises that the system, they will somehow make up for the things that the system has been denying them.
Well, Robert, closer to home, Senator Schumer recently had a formulation of the party trading blue-collar Democrats for college-educated Republicans. Is that a phenomenon that somehow fits into this?
Well, it kind of fits into a populist critique, right? And I agree with Ann that populism is such an elastic term. You have to wonder whether it has meaning. In
Well,
fact,
you have Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump
Right.
each being described as populists.
it makes sense from an establishment standpoint. It's people challenging the current structure, even if they may be incompatible themselves as to what they're proposing. But literally, since the demise, it's not totally dead, but the great weakening of the labor movement in the United States, and quite frankly, the campaign finance reforms post-Watergate, amended by Supreme Court decisions that cut the heart out of some of it. It led to a party that is much more, and big money politics, that needs to raise money in order to compete with Republicans, and has done so increasingly with the rising kind of tech billionaires on the West Coast, more finance capital than the old industrial capitalists who have more Democrats among them, and has both a kind of a weird kind of a base of lower income persons of color and higher income Democrats, right, who are knowledge workers, who are better educated, who many of them have high incomes. And so there's something to that. There's sort of a conflict within the party over that question, whether or not the party has had its heart taken out by not representing working class constituencies in a consistent way anymore since the 1970s. But it's been a process that's been going on for many decades. It isn't new.
Well, I'd like to read a quote by Bill Maher, if I could. The flyover states have become the passed-over states. There are two Americas. It seems like there's one where the cool jobs are, where people drive Teslas and eat artisanal ice cream, and we have orchestras and theater districts and world-class shopping. We have Chef Wolfgang Puck, and they have Chef Boyardee. Our roofs are solar panels. Theirs have last year's Christmas lights. We've got legal Bud. They've got Budweiser. So
He obviously hasn't been to Cedarburg.
But,
Well, no, that's a great point, because these cultural affinities that have been grafted upon the left are in very conservative communities as well. It's sort of a class analysis, right? And a class shaming to some degree, which probably, when it comes from elite liberals, does tend to reduce the appeal of the party among lower income people, right?
So how does this cut in other places? I mean, yeah, obviously we're familiar with some of these phenomena in our own political environment, but as you pointed out, John, this populist trend is not in any way restricted to the U.S. I mean, it's all over the world. So are we seeing similar phenomena other places?
What we're finding in the developing world is more those who have been left out, and that's true here, but it's in a different way in the developing world. It's the elites who have been probably skimming off of the aid packages that they were getting and the other assistance that was coming in and the sale of their resources, and it was not broadly distributed within the country. I think the developed world is a much more complicated one, and where we get tribalism going on and xenophobia and racism and all kinds of factors being fed into, and there isn't one block, and they may take common cause at a particular moment, but it doesn't necessarily last.
Well, let's stay on that theme of popular movements and economic instability, inequality, perceived government corruption, some of the things we've been talking about, fueled large-scale protests around the world throughout 2019. Some were peaceful, others were violent, but all shared the common element of people wanting to be heard, people feeling they're left out. So was there a common thread between these many movements?
It's interesting because I know there have been attempts to look at the extent to which violence is a part of them. The fact that the large movements, say let's say Hong Kong, for example, that they have tended to be, or in France, that have gone on for extended periods of time, involved millions of people, and they tend to be leaderless. In fact, there's a sort of a desire for anonymity with the whole symbol of the veil and the water symbol attached to some of the participants. They want to be nonviolent, and I think that's very smart. It's a question as to how long they can stay nonviolent. And they tend to shift between different, they might start because the price of bread goes up or the price of gas goes up, or, and then they'll shift to other causes. For example, in Hong Kong, the main reason for the current set of protests, because it's not the first one, had to do with an extradition bill where they were going to be allowed to extradite, the Hong Kong government to extradite people to mainland China. That's off the table now, but now they have other more pro-democracy demands. Same thing in France. They've gone from gas increases to pension reform. So those are commonalities. I think they're all driven certainly by social media and the internet, and they certainly pick up cues from each other, but there's no big coordinated plan, obviously, for it.
So, to what extent does this hark back to what we were just talking about? I mean, when the protests have their origins in a very proximate issue, like, some subsidy is reduced and whatever, why is it that they so quickly expand the demands to, we don't like much of anything that's going on these days?
Well, it's been known for a long time through anthropological, sociological research that when there's a spark, the spark seems random, but in fact it becomes the spark around existing grievances beneath the surface. So it didn't just become something else. Those frustrations were already there. And it differs based on the country, and Hong Kong's a little distinct from what I'm going to say, but this is going to relate to populism, and that is that the global, financialized, increasingly automated economy that's grown up since the 1970s has left a lot of people behind in developed countries, and there's a great frustration, and those tend to be older populations that are often, the whiter populations, particularly people who don't have the college degrees and other things that would make them mobile in this sort of knowledge-based economy. And then, of course, it's been terrible for a lot of people drawn into cities in less developed countries and their life. And so there's a great deal of frustration underneath the surface, and the political systems aren't making it better and can't cope with it. And there really was kind of a decision by, say, multinational corporations to prioritize growth and profits and not worry about the consequences, like what happens to a Flint, Michigan, or Saginaw, Michigan, or Gary, Indiana, when you just pull out all the means of production, all the means of a living wage job, or in Milwaukee to a large degree. Deindustrialization in Milwaukee has been horrific and has caused, ongoing, huge racial inequalities and huge, gigantic pockets of poverty. And so that's underneath the surface. And if there's a unification about the right-wing and left-wing populism, it is both are drawing on those frustrations, but have the solution come from a very different direction.
Mm-hmm.
So what about that, John? I mean, how can governments respond beyond just repression, just putting them down by force?
Well, I think I'll go back to this authoritarian and non-authoritarian governments. The more liberal-oriented democracies approach this in one way, and authoritarian governments in a very different way. And the culture has developed within these different systems for certain kinds of behavior and certain kinds of outcomes. And so sometimes in Tsarist Russia, there was every once in a while, it was a peasant revolt. But then when a more enlightened Tsar would come in and there would be some benefits that would flow, and then a repressive one would come in and put it back into its place. But it was always centrally driven, where in a democracy, it is much more difficult to be able to navigate through this process. Also, I think what Robert was talking about, and why the demands grow, as the movement grows, different elements come in which have different agenda in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, one case in point of a government dealing with such things is China. Their entrance into the WTO in 2001 was supposed to remake the communist economy into something resembling Western capitalism, but instead Beijing has leveraged its success to support a more assertive stance towards its neighbors and an aggressive economic approach that's altering trade, development, and supply chains across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, all without the hope for moves towards liberalization. So the former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, talking about some of the Chinese investment in activities in Africa, David Shin said very succinctly, they have a grand strategic plan, we don't. So is that the case?
Yes.
On to the next topic. So what about that? I mean, what if so, then what is the grand strategic plan?
The grand strategic plan is in this Belt and Road Initiative. That's the one that spans across 4 continents, is to ensure their own supply, their supply chains, to ensure that they have access to, I mean, they're building ports, they're building railroads, they're building infrastructure, and in the process, they're building a lot of the infrastructure that, for example, in Africa is needed, and so they're gaining long-term friends and long-term access in ways that the United States is not willing to do. The Chinese has an annual conference with African leaders, and generally most of the leaders go, over 50 leaders, and the United States doesn't have anything like that. Now they're giving away a lot of money, but there are strings attached in the sense that the African countries are becoming very indebted. And I'm just using Africa as an example here. But they're not putting the ties relating to, say, human rights performance on them that the United States and other countries might do with aid. It's definitely a long-term plan. It involves a huge long-term expenditure on the part of the Chinese.
But it also came with China amassing incredibly large foreign reserves, not dissimilar to what Russia did with the oil reserves and allowed them to become a bigger player.
So Robert, what about U.S. policy vis-a-vis China and Asia more generally? Is that helping or hurting the Chinese project?
That's a great question. It's certainly it's given an opportunity to the Chinese project in that, well, the motivation of the trade war, Robert Lighthizer, Trump's trade representative, is literally to try to make them operate more like the other developed countries and to follow the rules of WTO and not to use kind of the authoritarian centralized control you can get in a communist government or any major authoritarian government to manipulate the system to their country's advantage. I mean, in our case, American policy seems to be what the various competing multinational corporations that are considered quote unquote American, what they would like, which is not the same thing as having a national economic strategy. And so what it's done is it's pushed the Chinese even more to create their own supply chains because the TPP was not, U.S. did not go into it despite being negotiated by President Obama. That was designed to isolate China and cut them out of an Asian trading bloc that the United States would be part of. And so literally it may have actually, the tariffs haven't gotten any structural reforms in China and may in fact actually increasing the chances that China is going to escalate its ability to have its own supply chains and cut the U.S. out. Now the one silver lining would be that more regionalized trade has less of a climate impact because transportation of goods across huge swaths of ocean and over the air is actually very carbon intensive.
And China, when they do these projects, generally bring their own workers to do the project and set up Djibouti, for example, 70% of its gross domestic product is now tied to debt, to Chinese debt. And there is a port, I believe it's in Bangladesh, that now is owned by the Chinese because they couldn't afford to pay the interest on the debt.
So that brings up a good point. I mean, is there much possibility of sort of a pushback on the part of these recipient countries against that sort of traditional debt trap?
Well, it's already happening. When the new president of Malaysia, or I think the prime minister of Malaysia was elected, he backed off of the arrangements that they had made with the Chinese. It's all in the way in which you package these things. What we bring with our aid projects is we bring the human rights thing, which doesn't particularly go down well within the developing world. they have their own issues that they have, and it's their political ideology.
Well, is there something particular to the current government in Beijing that facilitates this process? I mean, we're talking about authoritarians. Mr. Xi seems to be quite fond of
emperor.
power.
Yeah.
Well, and he also looks like he's getting going on a war footing right now, as there's a party Congress that's in session right now that is talking about the entire country rallying behind the Communist Party.
And they have the rhetoric that he uses in terms of when they talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not, we want to take over the world. There's none of that. But clearly, if you look at what's happening, they're gaining, it's the long-term permanent access, and they're shifting, in some cases, these are markets the United States might be in, but now they're shifting over to the Chinese. So there's definitely an international economic shift going on. And if you couple that with President Xi's stated goal of unifying all of China, which means not only Hong Kong but Taiwan, before I think it was before 2040 or 2050, not too distant future, and what they're doing in the South China Sea. You put all that together, it looks like a very ambitious, aggressive international plan.
Yeah, and it was a doctrine after the Cold War in the U.S. that it was okay to aid authoritarian countries because all good things go together. If you give them economic, prosperity and capitalism, then that's tied to democracy, and that, which was it was clearly the case then, but now it's been clearly discredited. And you can have a full capitalist economy under communist authoritarian control. It can be quite successful. Right. And so they were not fit naturally together. It's just an American bias that they would.
Part of the downside to this trade wars is affecting institutions like your own. Education. The Chinese are not sending nearly as many students to the United States as they once did. And as the State Department has been known to say, foreign students is a major foreign exchange earner for the United States.
It was masking a lot of our disinvestments in education. Their universities are making up for it by bringing in full freight paying Chinese students.
A lot of Chinese students. Yeah.
Well, before our time slips away, Robert, I would be remiss if we didn't look at how concerns about climate change are beginning to shape policy around the world. 2019, those concerns thrust 16-year-old Swedish activist Greta Thunberg onto the global stage. So what do you think? Is 2020 the year governments become serious about climate policy? There was a recent UN climate meeting, after which the Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, if we do not change course by 2020, we risk missing the point where we can avoid runaway climate change with disastrous consequences for people and all natural systems that sustain us. So are we at a tipping point?
We are, because we have to, by 2030, according to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reduce emissions by 45%, which requires us to start doing it right away if we're going to make that happen. And it happened, obviously, the U.S. pulling out entirely with Donald Trump is a major challenge to this, and Russia is, of course, not being helpful at all in this because of their dependence upon natural resources and fossil fuels. But the thing is that a lot of the world has been at least shamed into saying we want to meet the target. And then, of course, it becomes harder to actually do it because a politician, by definition, they're caught betwixt and between. They know they need to do it, but they don't want to actually risk themselves politically in a way to take on the interests you would need to actually shake things up enough. You see this with Trudeau in Canada, where he is doubling down on meeting, in fact, beating the UN targets for Canada, but wants to approve the mining of all of these tar sands, which have to stay in the ground in order to actually meet any climate targets or prevent a climate catastrophe. And so it's going to be, Greta Thunberg is playing a role in this movement in holding these countries accountable, but it's going to take a lot to make them actually do the difficult and destabilizing political things we would need to meet the target, but we got to do it, quite frankly. We'll see if we pull it off.
Well, did you feel shamed by Greta, Mr. Katzka?
Oh, come on. What we're dealing with is economic viability versus climate change requirements. And the politicians can say one thing in these gatherings, these summits that they have, but they go back and they have to worry about where the jobs are going to be and whether or not they're going to be able to stay, whether the protests are going to drive them out of office.
Well, in the less than a minute we have left, and
No,
obviously
but
this
I
is a coordinated
disagree.
global action.
Good.
Yes, no, I disagree because with the economic effects of with the extreme weather, you know, the floods, and we see this are millions and millions of dollars. So
But there's going to be winners and losers in this process.
There will be, but this is going to affect developed countries and developing countries because of all the huge floods and all this that we're seeing. Look at Australia right now.
I'm
It's
not
horrific.
disagreeing with you.
You did, though.
Well, what I'm saying is that the governments are going to make decisions based on their needs as opposed to global needs.
Yeah, well, they're political needs. The
Yeah.
constraints
Right.
are not real, they're human. We could overcome them if we had the will to do
And
so.
if we had really strong leadership.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. To our panel, thank you as always, and Happy New Year to our
Happy New Year
viewers.
to our viewers.
We'll see you next time on International Focus.
Strong democratic leadership, I think John took.